Last week, we started to overturn that firmly established myth that the Church has been an enemy of science. Today, we're going to bury that myth once and for all. So join me for the Catholic Church, builder of Welcome to the Catholic Church, builder of civilization. I'm Dr. Thomas Woods. Last time, we engaged in some myth-busting. We looked at things everybody knows. The Church is an enemy of science, right? Everybody knows that. We're all taught that in school. What we started to see was that modern professors who actually do this for a living are starting to say something like the opposite. They're starting to say we need to be fair to the Catholic Church and give her her due in the development of science in the Western world. And some have gone so far as to ask the truly forbidden question, is the development of science in Western civilization something that may have occurred because of the Catholic Church rather than in spite of it, as we're so often told? Last time we placed particular emphasis on a central teaching that modern science takes for granted, namely that the world we live in makes sense. You can understand it. You can expect to find patterns in it if you investigate it. You can expect to find mathematical relationships if you investigate it. In fact, you can hope to reduce the phenomena of nature to some kind of mathematical formula so as to understand it better and predict it better. Well, where did this crazy idea come from? It came right out of the Bible with Wisdom 11:21 that tells us that God has ordered all things according to measure, number, and weight. And we saw that the early church fathers, the cathedral school at Chartres, and others besides took this to mean the universe makes sense, so let's go find out about it. Let's go study it. Let's go use the scientific method, gather data, formulate hypotheses, and then test those hypotheses. You can't do any of these things unless you already believe the universe makes sense and is orderly and follows consistent laws. And that idea comes from the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church insists that God is a God of order, and He's a God who has built patterns into our universe that we can discover using our minds. Science is impossible without this fundamental insight, and I gave examples last time of civilizations who, lacking that insight, also lacked science. This time, we're going to talk a little bit more about specifics. We're going to name names today. We're going to look at specific people who were Catholics who pioneered in the sciences. And specifically, we're even going to look at people who invented things and who made discoveries that we take for granted today, but that are typically forgotten or left out of the standard textbook treatment. So, for instance, I don't think it's particularly well known that 35 craters on the moon are named after Jesuit scientists and mathematicians. I also don't think it's particularly well known that when you look at the history of mathematics, a great many of the greatest mathematicians who ever lived were Jesuits. People don't realize that. Is that taught in school? Not usually. But it's very interesting that in the early 19th century, when an early historian of mathematics set about chronicling the 300 or so greatest mathematicians of the previous 27 centuries, so going back to 900 BC, and then going to his day about 1800 AD, those 27 centuries, he found that of the 300, about 5% were Jesuits. Now, consider how significant that is. The Jesuits were around for only little over two of those 27 centuries. Because the Jesuits, remember, were founded in 1540, and then they were suppressed briefly in the 1770s, so a little over 2 centuries, and yet still, in an impartial compilation of the greatest mathematicians of all time, it turns out that 1 out of every 20 belongs to this single order of Catholic priests. Well, again, rather significant, is it not? But We'll leave even the Jesuit accomplishments to the side now. Let's mention Roger Bacon, a great 13th century figure. Roger Bacon was a Franciscan who taught at Oxford and who's been considered a forerunner of the scientific revolution. Roger Bacon emphasized the importance of experimentation and observation. These are the key aspects of modern science, that we don't simply rely on what other people have said. Well, Aristotle was really smart, so we'll just sort of more or less go with him. We have to verify scientific conclusions on the basis of either our own observations or on the basis of experiments by people who are carrying them out according to the sound principles of scientific method. Now, Roger Bacon consistently emphasized this, and he said, without experiment, nothing can be adequately known. An argument proves theoretically, but does not give the certitude necessary to remove all doubt. Nor will the mind repose in the clear view of truth unless it finds it by way of experiment. Well, there is a scientific turn of mind right there with Roger Bacon in the 13th century at Oxford. Among other things, Roger Bacon identified the following as obstacles to the transmission of truth: uninstructed popular opinion and long-standing but erroneous custom. Well, all of these, both of these things, I think, the church is usually accused of encouraging. Well, you're just going along with what people say, or you're trying to form what they think. You're trying to get them to believe crazy superstition. But in fact, to the contrary, Roger Bacon is saying these are the things we have to try to avoid. We have to use experimentation and our own observation, because maybe what people believe is untrue. We need to verify things using experiment. Or St. Albert the Great, who taught at the University of Paris. One of his students was St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Albert, according to the Dictionary of Scientific Biography, was proficient in all branches of science. He was one of the most famous precursors of modern science in the High Middle Ages. That's why in 1941, Pope Pius XII named him the patron of all who cultivate the natural sciences. And well, he should. In fact, he was so prolific, his output spanned so many disciplines, that even people who despise the church continue to admire Albert the Great, Albertus Magnus. The aim of natural science, he said, was not simply to accept the statements of others, that is, what is narrated by people, but to investigate the causes that are at work in nature for ourselves. Well, there you go. Now, let's get down to some brass tacks here, though. Let's move further toward the present and consider some long-forgotten names. For example, Father Nicholas Steno was in fact considered to be the father of stratigraphy, which is in fact the study of the layers of the Earth's surface. And geologists need to know Steno's principles. He later became a Catholic priest, and in the late 1980s, he was beatified by Pope John Paul II, who praised him for his sanctity and his science. I'd like to focus specifically, though, on the Jesuits, because they, I think, have been criticized like no other religious group in the Catholic world over the centuries. They've been thrown out of countries, they've been banned, they've been suppressed, they've been imprisoned, they've been killed. It's unbelievable, the calumny against the Jesuits. And yet, and here I'm quoting an expert on the Jesuits who has no axe to grind in this one way or the other, the Jesuits by the 18th century had contributed to the development of pendulum clocks, pantographs, barometers, reflecting telescopes and microscopes, to scientific fields as various as magnetism, optics, and electricity. They observed, in some cases before anyone else, the colored bands on Jupiter's surface, the Andromeda Nebula, and Saturn's rings. They theorized about the circulation of the blood independently of Harvey, the theoretical possibility of flight, the way the moon affected the tides, and the wave-like nature of light. Star maps of the southern hemisphere, symbolic logic, flood control measures, introducing plus and minus signs into Italian mathematics, all were typical Jesuit achievements. Now, I'm sorry to sound like a broken record, but how often are students taught this in school? Never. It's not like they're taught it a little or once in a while they hear about this, they never hear it. They never hear it. I've never seen a Western civilization textbook that takes note of this phenomenon. Not one. And believe me, over many an anguished night when I was a professor in New York, I would search through Western Civ textbooks, one after the other. Which one of these can I assign in good conscience? And it was hard to find any. So what I wound up having to do, in case you're wondering, is assign a not-so-good textbook, but then also assign my own How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization. And I took some comfort in knowing that, okay, maybe the students won't read my book, but these are the same students who won't read the textbook either. And so one encouraging thing about the fact that we live in a world in which students don't read is that they won't be reading the propaganda either. And so it'll be easier for me to de-brainwash them, because they won't be reading anything. They won't be reading anything to contradict that. They'll actually finally get to hear the truth for a change, unmediated. But consider now some more specific examples of Jesuits and their achievements. We have only a minute before we have the break, but let's consider Father Giambattista Riccioli was the first person to calculate how fast a freely falling body accelerates to the ground. Surprising, isn't it? Father Francesco Grimaldi first discovered and named the phenomenon of the diffraction of light. Now, Father Francesco Grimaldi, you may be thinking about pasta sauce, but that's Francesco Rinaldi, and I'm sure Francesco Grimaldi would be appalled at that sauce. But what's interesting about the two of them is that they worked together to produce a selenograph, which is a detailed description, or pardon me, a detailed map, in effect, of the surface of the moon, depicting all the various aspects of it. And their selenograph adorns the entrance to this day to the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. These were not stupid idiots. Now, there are still other scientists we have to cover, and we'll be getting to them a little bit after the break. But for now, let's just note that it isn't just that we've got a bunch of scattered scientists here and there. It's that in practically every scientific discipline, there are priests who are involved, not just Catholic laymen, but priests who occupy this most important vocation in the Church. So join me in a minute. Let's keep doing some myth busting. Welcome back to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. We've been looking today at unknown and forgotten Catholic scientists who were not simply Catholics, but who were Catholic priests. So I think this helps to overturn the idea that there is some necessary contradiction between being a Catholic and being a scientist, between the Catholic faith and scientific endeavor. Now, any one of the people that I've mentioned up to now, and whom I will mention in a moment, would make the subject of an excellent term paper or book. And yet, astonishingly little is written about these great Jesuit scientists. In fact, can you believe there is nothing in the English language, there is no systematic study in the English language of the Jesuit scientists? There's no book on the subject. So graduate students out there, here's your project. Okay, you get your job somewhere. We need you to start working on this, because this is a lost and forgotten chapter in the history of Western civilization, and it doesn't deserve to be. These men deserve better, and the Catholic Church deserves better, because we would go a long way toward overturning a lot of this mythology if people simply knew some of this information. But unfortunately, they don't. You have to be some kind of a code breaker to figure it out, to find it in the midst of all the nonsense out there in the world. And there are books on every bizarre subject under the sun, hundreds of them on everything, nothing on the Jesuit scientists, and yet it would be a work of many volumes to write this stuff. But it needs to be done. Somebody should do it. I don't want to do it. It would take too long, and I don't have time, but I want somebody to do it. It's an important project. Let's consider another Jesuit in the modern period, Father Athanasius Kircher. My confirmation name is Athanasius, so I have a certain kinship to Father Kircher. Among other things, he's considered to be the father of Egyptology. Maybe a new word, but it simply means the study of ancient Egypt. And Father Kircher is known as the father of Egyptology because of his great scholarly work, and he did that work even before we discovered the so-called Rosetta Stone, which helped us to decode and decipher the various hieroglyphic symbols. In fact, it was because of Father Kircher's work that when we did find the Rosetta Stone, scholars knew what to look for, knew how to approach the subject. He's been called the master of 100 arts, and a historian writing as recently as 2003 said that Father Kircher is one of the few people of whom it can be justly said that all knowledge was his domain. Astonishing, we've never heard of this guy. His work in chemistry helped to debunk alchemy, which was this sort of phony science that alleged that you could take base metals and somehow transmute them into gold. There were serious scientists, even Isaac Newton and Boyle, who took this seriously. And it was Father Athanasius Kircher who helped to throw cold water on it. Again, forgotten, down the Orwellian memory hole. Roger Boscovich was a Catholic priest who is known to many as the father of atomic theory. In fact, Werner Heisenberg, in the 20th century, of Heisenberg uncertainty principle fame for all you scientists out there, gave a paper in which he praised and honored Father Boscovich. And a great many other scientists have also pointed to him in the 18th century as being the father of atomic theory. He's been called the greatest genius Yugoslavia ever produced, and yet forgotten. Let's consider the study of earthquakes, seismology. The Jesuits were particularly well placed to study seismology because they had universities all over the United States and, of course, indeed around the world. So they could build up seismographic equipment at these various universities and collect data about earthquakes and then bring it all together and systematize it and examine it from a central location. So they began in the early 20th century building seismological stations at their universities across the United States. Now, let's also consider, by the way, that it was a Jesuit who wrote the very first book on seismology in the United States. The first textbook on seismology in the United States was written in 1936 by Father J.B. McIlwain. Father McIlwain, by the way, has a medal named after him. Every year, the American Geophysical Union awards a medal to an aspiring young geophysicist. And that medal is named after Father McIlwain, the great Jesuit who wrote the first such textbook in America and who also served as the president of the American Geophysical Union. For these reasons, the study of earthquakes, or seismology, has become known as the Jesuit science. Now, do people know about this? No, but should they? The question answers itself. What else did the Jesuits do, though? Sure, they were studying about earthquakes and measuring freely falling bodies and studying ancient Egypt and studying chemistry. So what have you done for us lately? Well, it so happens that from the beginning, at least from the 18th century all the way up to the present, Jesuit scientists have traveled around the world, bringing knowledge of Western science everywhere they went, to places as far off as China and India. They built up, in effect, the scientific infrastructure of a great many countries around the world, ranging all the way from Ecuador to the Philippines and beyond. Throughout South America, for example, they set up meteorological and seismological stations all over the place, which were particularly helpful in, obviously, in predicting the weather and keeping an eye on various kinds of natural disasters. People have the Jesuits to thank for that. Now, here's a part of the history of science that's been totally forgotten. I realize the whole episode is stuff that's been totally forgotten, but this has been forgotten squared, which is the history of modern cathedrals and basilicas in Western Europe. It turns out that a good number of these cathedrals and basilicas were actually built to function not only as cathedrals and basilicas, but also to function as solar observatories. It turns out that from the 17th and 18th centuries onward, there was no better mechanism anywhere in the world, nothing more precise, better mechanism anywhere in the world, nothing more precise than these cathedrals and basilicas for measuring the perceived motion of the sun. And they were constructed so that you could observe the sun's apparent movement on the floor using various shadows and the like. Well, this is extremely significant because, in fact, modern astronomers were able to use these precise instruments in order to verify important theories about planetary orbits. For example, it was a Catholic astronomer named Giovanni Cassini who used the Cathedral of San Petronio in Bologna, in the heart of the Papal States, where the Pope lives, the Pope who's supposedly discouraging the sciences. It was in that basilica that this Catholic astronomer Cassini used the mechanism of this basilica to in fact verify Johannes Kepler's theories of planetary motion. That was done in the Papal States in a Catholic basilica by a Catholic astronomer. And Kepler himself, by the way, who was not a Catholic, nevertheless consistently observed that his favorite scientific correspondents were Jesuits, were Catholic priests, because they were so knowledgeable. They understood what he was talking about, unlike most of the world. Again, these are forgotten chapters, but they don't need to be. And they're starting to be brought out little by little. Isn't it interesting that it was a professor at UC Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley is not exactly known as being a big cheerleading institution for the Catholic Church. We'll put it that way. But Professor Heilbronn there wrote a book, about 5 or 6 years ago, called The Sun in the Church. And he told the story, this forgotten story, about the use of cathedrals and basilicas in the advancement of our knowledge of astronomy. In fact, Heilbronn went and said that there is no institution anywhere on earth that had done more for the advancement of astronomy or contributed more resources to this study than the Catholic Church. Now, in large part, the Catholic Church did that because we wanted to be able to predict equinoxes, for instance, so that we could establish when Easter should be celebrated and establish it far enough in advance that we could enjoy a 40-day period of penance in advance, namely Lent. But nevertheless, once they're built, scientists begin to use them, Catholic scientists, and advances science. A totally forgotten chapter, finally being brought forth by a figure, as far as I know, isn't Catholic at all, but just is interested to recover important work and discoveries that, for one reason or another, we've forgotten about. Now, the objection in the back of people's minds, and it's an understandable one at this point, is, what about Galileo? Because you can talk all you want about all the wonderful things the Church did for science in general, and astronomy in particular. But what about Galileo? I mean, wasn't he tortured, and didn't they try to kill him or something because he disagreed with the Church? But that is part of a mythology that, let's say, is extremely difficult to dislodge from people's minds. Now, I think it is safe to say that the Galileo episode is not exactly the Church's shining moment, and it should be acknowledged that there is reason for regret about it, to say the least. In fact, in my 7 years as a university professor in New York, I would say that the one episode that did more than everything else put together to discredit the Catholic Church in the minds of my students was the perceived history of the Galileo episode. There's no question about it. So the consequences of it were just disastrous. At the same time, I think it is important to revisit this episode for two reasons. First, because so that it won't seem as if we're just trying to duck it, or that I'm just trying to find the good news and not dwell on the not so good. But secondly, because I think the standard telling of the Galileo story is incomplete, or is unfair, or is one-sided. Yes, it's, as I say, it's nothing to be particularly proud of, but at the same time, there are facts, I think, that deserve mention. And before getting into the details of Galileo, we'll just simply say this. Galileo was a genius and had much of importance to say, but his central thesis, that in fact the Earth orbits the Sun rather than the other way around, could not be established in his day to the satisfaction of all thinking people. I think the assumption is that if you thought that the Sun went around the Earth in the 1600s, you must be some kind of a dolt. You know, you need to be smacked in the face or something. What's the matter with you? Don't you study science? But in fact, those who believe that the Sun went around the Earth in the 17th century, in some ways, still had the better of the argument. they had important arguments to advance against Galileo that he himself could not answer. In fact, if you raised them to Galileo, he'd pretty much have to say, hey, look over there, and then run away, because he's got no answer for them. So next time, we're going to take our time and go through this Galileo case step by step, see what really did happen to him, what didn't happen to him, and we'll look at the arguments that were used. And I'm going to give a detailed explanation of the arguments that people who disagreed with Galileo made, to show you they weren't stupid, they weren't just ignorant religious people. They were making arguments that had gone unanswered since the days of Aristotle. And they were explaining that if you're going to say that our interpretation of the Bible up to now, which some people said that the sun was going around the earth, you're going to tell us that's wrong, the science better be absolutely ironclad, true, and proved for sure. But it wasn't. And Galileo did not get the better of the argument. So that's where we're going to pick up next time. Let's look at Galileo and see what really happened next time on the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. Thanks.